How do we know that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus was seen as a myth by the earliest Christians, being, the disciples of the disciples, or of the disciples themselves? If we read 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16, it says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitness of his majesty." So what this means is, what 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 means is that the earliest Christians, being the disciples or the disciples of the disciples, were saying that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus were seen as cleverly devised stories, or they were seen as myths. So the gospel, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus, that Paul was propagating, was seen as a cleverly devised story or a myth, by the earliest Christians, being the disciples or the students of the disciples. So what that means is the second generation of believers were forging stuff like 2 Peter to prove that the gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection was a true story, and not and was not a cleverly devised story, as 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 tells us, that the earliest Christians were saying that Jesus' death and resurrection was seen as a cleverly devised myth, or a cleverly devised story. So it's not a what that means is the earliest Christians did not believe in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. The second generation of Christians were doing their best to try to prove the gospel, the gospel of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this means that the earliest Christians didn't really believe that. We also have 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 1, which I'll get to right now, where there's unknown Christians who are denying the Lord, or denying the story of Jesus. So what this means is, going back to 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16, it's like, notice what this verse says: "For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about." So the earliest people, the earliest Christians, being the disciples or the students of the disciples, were saying that Paul's gospel was seen as a myth or a cleverly devised story, and not the real story of Jesus Christ, and what happened to Jesus Christ at the very end of his ministry on earth. So it's Paul who propagated the gospel, and not the disciples or the students of the disciples. And the disciples or the students of the disciples were saying that the crucifixion and resurrection story was a cleverly devised myth, or a cleverly devised story. So what 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 is telling us is that the earliest generation did not believe Paul's gospel, or they did not believe that Paul's gospel of the death and resurrection of Jesus was accurately describing what the disciples were teaching, or what the real gospel of Jesus was. This is Paul's invention of Jesus's gospel, which the earliest Christians rejected and were mocking, and were saying was a cleverly devised story. So 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 tells us that the second generation was trying to believe what Paul was saying, or they were trying to defend Paul's version of the gospel, when the earliest Christians were rejecting it and saying it was a cleverly devised myth, or a cleverly devised story. So we know that Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection was seen as a myth, or a cleverly devised story, by the earliest Christians, and was not a accurate representation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Stay tuned, more videos coming up ahead.